Have you ever noticed that the people who change the world often don't fit the mold? They see problems where others see normalcy. They question systems that everyone else accepts. They're not smarter necessarily, but they think differently. These are disruptive thinkers, and today we're diving deep into the psychology that makes them tick. When we talk about disruptive thinkers, we're talking about people like Steve Jobs, who disrupted entire industries. We're talking about scientists who challenged established dogma and changed the course of human knowledge. We're talking about social activists who refuse to accept that's just how things are. But what's really going on in their minds? What psychological patterns drive these people? The first thing to understand is that disruptive thinkers have a fundamentally different relationship with rules and authority. Most people are raised to respect rules. We learn early on that following rules keeps us safe, keeps us accepted, keeps us moving smoothly through society. But disruptive thinkers seem to have a different wiring. They don't reject rules out of rebellion necessarily. Instead, they're constantly asking why the rules exist in the first place. When a rule doesn't make sense to them, when they see a logical gap or an outdated assumption, they feel almost compelled to challenge it. This comes from something psychologists call low conformity bias. While most people have a natural tendency to go along with what the group does, disruptive thinkers have less of this automatic compliance. They're more willing to stand alone if their logic leads them there. But here's the interesting part. This isn't the same as being contrarian for the sake of it. Disruptive thinkers aren't trying to be different. They're trying to be right. The difference stands out only because their conclusions diverge from mainstream thinking. The second psychological trait is what I call tolerating productive discomfort. Most of us have an inherent need for closure and certainty. We feel better when things make sense, when we have answers. But disruptive thinkers can sit in ambiguity much longer than average. They can hold multiple conflicting ideas in their mind simultaneously without rushing to choose. This is sometimes called cognitive complexity. It allows them to see connections that others miss, because they're not forcing premature conclusions. Think about Elon Musk trying to colonize Mars. Everyone said it was impossible, but he didn't need the validation that it was impossible to go away before he started working on it. He could hold the contradiction between "this seems impossible" and "but here's why it might work anyway." This ability to live in contradiction is actually highly correlated with creative breakthroughs. The third characteristic is what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. Disruptive thinkers are driven by internal goals rather than external rewards. They're not primarily motivated by money or status, though those often follow. They're motivated by solving problems, by understanding how things work, by building something that didn't exist before. When you survey successful disruptive thinkers about why they do what they do, the answers are remarkably consistent. They couldn't not do it. The problem bothered them too much. The gap in the market frustrated them. The injustice kept them awake at night. This intrinsic motivation is psychologically protective too. When you're driven by external rewards like approval or money, you're vulnerable. When people criticize you or the money dries up, your motivation collapses. But when you're driven intrinsically by something internal, external setbacks feel less devastating. This is why disruptive thinkers often persevere through circumstances that would break most people's spirits. The fourth element is what I call pattern recognition on a different level. Disruptive thinkers don't just see patterns that others see. They see patterns that others don't see. They find connections between seemingly unrelated fields. They notice when something in one industry could solve a problem in another industry. This comes partly from diverse interests, and partly from how their brain organizes information. They're naturally inclined to look for deep principles underlying surface phenomena. Steve Jobs famously connected calligraphy, music, and technology in ways that seemed random until you saw the result. The psychology here is that disruptive thinkers have broader neural networks connecting different areas of their brain. Literally and figuratively, they make different connections than most people do. Now, the fifth psychological factor is resilience combined with self-doubt. This might seem contradictory, but it's crucial. Disruptive thinkers aren't overconfident. In fact, many of them experience significant self-doubt. They question themselves constantly, but they don't let self-doubt stop them. They move forward despite it. This is actually psychologically healthier than overconfidence because overconfident people don't learn from failure. But disruptive thinkers, driven by self-doubt, are constantly refining and improving. They have what psychologist Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. They believe that abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. This transforms setbacks from "I failed because I'm not capable" to "I failed because I need a different approach." It's a subtle but profound psychological difference. The sixth trait is cognitive flexibility. This is the ability to switch between thinking about different concepts and to think about multiple concepts at the same time. People with high cognitive flexibility can change strategies when they encounter new information. They don't get stuck in one way of thinking about a problem. When their first solution doesn't work, they can easily shift to a second or third approach. This ties directly into problem-solving ability. Research shows that cognitive flexibility is one of the strongest predictors of real-world innovation. Disruptive thinkers aren't trying harder at the same problem. They're trying different problems entirely. The seventh element is often overlooked, but it's crucial: comfort with being misunderstood. Disruptive thinkers spend a lot of time explaining things to people who don't get it. They propose ideas that sound crazy until they're not. They work in fields that others dismiss. And psychologically, this requires a certain emotional resilience. You have to be able to pitch an idea and watch people dismiss it without that destroying your sense of self-worth. Many disruptive thinkers report that they learned early on not to need external validation. Sometimes this came from having different interests than their peers. Sometimes from having parents who encouraged unconventional thinking. Sometimes from simple personality differences. But that independence from needing everyone to understand them is psychologically liberating. It frees them to pursue ideas without constantly checking if others agree. The eighth psychological factor is what I call passionate about fundamentals. While many people want to skip to success, disruptive thinkers are often obsessed with understanding how things actually work at a deep level. They read widely. They ask lots of questions. They follow their curiosity down rabbit holes. This might look like inefficiency to an outsider, but it's actually building an incredibly detailed mental model of how the world works. When you understand fundamentals deeply, you can see possibilities that others miss. You can identify the leverage points in systems. You understand what can actually be disrupted versus what's core to a system's function. The ninth aspect is purposefulness without preciousness. Disruptive thinkers have a strong sense of purpose, but they're not precious about their ideas. They're willing to throw things away and start over if they discover a better approach. They're not ego-attached to their ideas. This is actually the opposite of what many people assume. You might think disruptive thinkers are egomaniacs who believe their vision is perfect. But actually, many of the most effective ones are ruthlessly willing to abandon ideas that aren't working. This comes from a psychological distinction between identity and ideas. They separate who I am from what I believe right now. This allows them to change beliefs without feeling like they're changing who they are. The 10th characteristic is something I call embracing constraint creatively. Most people see constraints as limiting. Disruptive thinkers often see constraints as creative problems to solve. If you have limited budget, that constraint forces you to be more creative. If you have limited time, that constraint forces prioritization. Rather than resenting constraints, they often use constraints as a thinking tool. There's a reason so many world-changing innovations come from resource-poor environments. The constraint forces a different kind of thinking. Now here's what's crucial to understand. Not all disruptive thinkers have all of these traits equally. These are patterns we see across them, but they're not a checklist. Some of these traits people are born with. Some are developed through experience. Some come from environment and upbringing. But here's the really important part. If you're not a natural disruptive thinker, you can develop these psychological patterns. Cognitive flexibility can be trained. Comfort with ambiguity can be built. Intrinsic motivation can be cultivated. The growth mindset can be adopted. These aren't fixed traits, they're psychological skills. The mistake many people make is thinking that disruptive thinking is some rare gift. But actually, it's more about a set of psychological habits and ways of relating to problems and ideas. Anyone can develop these. It requires deliberately questioning assumptions. It requires sitting with discomfort long enough to see what's actually there. It requires caring more about being right than about being agreeable. The psychology of disruptive thinkers teaches us something important about human potential. We're not locked into one way of thinking. We can change how we approach problems. We can become more comfortable with uncertainty, more flexible in our thinking, more driven by intrinsic purpose. We can develop the psychological patterns that lead to genuine disruption and meaningful change. The world doesn't need everyone to be a disruptive thinker. That would probably be chaos. But it needs more people willing to think in these ways. It needs more people asking why. More people questioning assumptions. More people willing to pursue visions that seem impossible until they're not. If this resonates with you, if you feel that pull to see things differently and question the status quo, that's not something to suppress or apologize for. That's your mind working the way disruptive thinkers' minds work. The psychology is there. The capability is there. What matters now is whether you have the courage to follow it.